Our intention today is to share a little bit with you about how Atlassian thinks about and uses some core communication tools, and then hopefully we'll have time to have a discussion with you all in terms of how you use those tools, whether it's similar or different to how we're doing it, and learn from each other. But before we dive into all of that, we'll give you a little context on who we are and why we have any business being here speaking to you about this stuff. Sarah, kick us off.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm an avid reader, cook, concert goer, coffee snob, Raptor enthusiast, wife and mother, and in my spare time, I'm principal writer at Atlassian. So that means that I write things like our quarterly shareholder letter, I do a lot of executive ghostwriting support, and I've authored probably close to 200 posts on the Atlassian blog, which is to say that I have learned a whole lot about communicating with external audiences, and fortunately, about 99% of that applies to communicating internally with my colleagues, which of course is the focus of our talk today.
Just want to do a quick check. Can folks hear us that are here? Okay, I saw some people playing around, so wanted to make sure. Sarah is an absolute legend at Atlassian, so I'm really honored to share the stage with her today. My name is India Wade. I am an operations program manager at Atlassian, so I deal with things like planning, headcount, budget, org scaling, and a lot of what that means is communicating how we're going to do all of those processes, and then taking in the feedback and input people have on those processes to improve them. In my personal life, I am a poet. You may or may not have read my work, which has been heavily featured in the Notes app of my own personal iPhone and a very well-hidden Instagram account. Nonetheless, the through line in my personal and professional life is thinking about communication and how we do it. And when I say how we do it, it's not just the words on the page to describe a reorg or to hold a poem, but it's also the channels that we choose to share those things in. So what do I mean by that? As an example, when I think about poetry, I would argue that a book of poems is an excellent way to illuminate the human experience and share it with one another. But it's not always going to be the best channel, so to speak. If I use a book of haikus as a legally binding contract in a merger and acquisition, it's probably going to be pretty inefficient and confusing, but I would argue way more fun. Likewise, in our day-to-day work lives, I think we've all been in that meeting that could have been a quick message on Slack. And we've also had those Slack threads that go on and on and on and on, and probably should have been a 5-minute meeting. So in all of these examples, whether it's a haiku or a meeting, the issue isn't that the channel itself is inherently flawed or frustrating, it's that how we're using the channel is flawed and frustrating. And the thing about communication is it's often so organic for each of us that we don't always realize what's happening or think about how we're using something in this manner.
Let me give you an example. I've worked at companies that had very, very strong email cultures, like very little use of chat, and the only things that were shared as documents would be something like a company policy or a test plan or a product roadmap, things, really heavyweight stuff like that. Everything else came through email. So I felt like I had to be checking my email all the time. And every time I would go into my inbox, I would have to wade through these endless threads that would become totally disjointed after like the 4th or 5th reply all. So with each new message that came through, I'd have to figure out like, okay, what part of the original message is this person referring to? And is that part of the original message even still relevant given the discussion that's gone on since? And what I didn't realize at the time was how draining that is. I mean, it was sucking away all this time and energy, and I never even noticed it, much less thought to question it, because that's just the way it is, right? Then I came to Atlassian, where we use chat and Confluence a lot more than we use email, and oh my gosh, suddenly I felt like I had more time and I wasn't so wiped at the end of the day. But it literally took me changing jobs to realize that I had been using email in a way that was not optimal for me.
So as Sarah's alluding to with that email example, we do have a fairly unique way of, as we say at Atlassian, getting shit done. and I'm sure each and every one of you do as well at your companies. Communication is this bizarre network of organic and planned cultures, processes, and norms, and it's going to be unique for every company and for every individual. So we're never going to have that silver bullet blueprint for how to communicate, and that's not what this presentation is intended to be. But why Sarah and I think it is valuable to spend 20 minutes to pull back the curtain and tell you a little bit about how Atlassian communicates is that it can be really useful to get exposure to how other companies do things. Just having that exposure can kind of help shake up your brain, help you see things with new perspectives, and then open your eyes to new possibilities. So that's what we're hoping to do today.
And the way that we're going to do it is like this. First, we're going to take you through a tour of how Atlassian uses 4 core communication channels. So I'm talking email, documents, chat, and meetings. Second, we're going to show you a framework for kind of how deciding like what channels to use in what different situations, and then another framework for conducting an audit of your communication practices so that you can dig into that with your team and see if maybe there are some areas where you want to change things up and experiment a little bit. And then last, hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So we're going to start this little tour someplace really exciting with a legal disclaimer. We won't be talking about Atlassian's product roadmaps or anything like that in our presentation today, but we are obligated to show this slide, so please read.
And just to keep things on theme, I also rewrote the legal disclaimer as a haiku. I have to say our legal department has not cleared this at all, but I am still willing to do a dramatic reading at the end if anyone's interested.
All right, now we can get started for real. As I said, today we're going to focus on 4 communication channels that are most commonly seen, like really at every workplace nowadays. And as an Atlassian, I do have to note that there are other communication tools that are important too, like we've been hearing about Atlas for status updates and Jira Work Management for project tracking. But we're going to focus on email, chat, documents, and meetings because those 4 go across Atlassian. Everyone in the company uses those, and we're guessing that that's the same case at your organization too. To start, I want to lay out some foundational principles that Atlassian follows across all 4 of these channels. First, transparency. Openness is definitely a recurring theme at Atlassian. In fact, one of our company values is open company, no bullshit. And that means no competition between teams, no incentives to hoard information. Our mindset is one of sharing information freely whenever it's practical, and honestly, sometimes even when it's not practical. So that's the perspective on transparency that India and I are coming in with today. But we also realize that openness and free-flowing sharing is not necessarily a slam dunk fit for every organization. So again, we're not here to tell you how to run your show, where it's really just about sparking some ideas that you might take back to your team. In addition to transparency, we optimize for future-proofing. That is, making information easy to find later. Like easy for ourselves to find later, sure, but also easy for the people around us. I might go on vacation or get sick one day or go to another team or go to another company, perish the thought, but it might happen. Actually, probably not. In any case, the idea is to make sure that my colleagues can find all the information that they need from me, even when I'm not around. And last, we try to make sure that we're sharing the right information and the right amount of information at the right time and with the appropriate context. So when we share, we'll think about things like, okay, who really needs to know this right now? Like everyone else can find out later, but who needs to know now? And do these people have enough context already that this new information is going to make sense to them? Will they be able to connect all the dots? And the reason that we do this really is that with all of this free-flowing information and all this sharing, it can add up to potentially a lot of information to absorb. At Atlassian, we have this phrase, we joke about drinking from the fire hose. Well, we don't want to make people drink from a fire hose if we don't have to, because that is just overwhelming and not fun for anyone.
All right, so with these principles in mind, we're going to explore the communication tools that Sarah mentioned. And this graphic is going to be how we orient ourselves today. So on the vertical axis, you're going to see dynamic and real-time communications mapped against structured and asynchronous communications. On the horizontal axis, what's mapped out is the size of the information being shared. So is it a ton of information, a full meal, or is it just a bit, a quick snack? We're going to start with a channel that for Atlassian falls in the snackable async quadrant of this graphic, which is email. And we're going to have people who are here with us in person do this by show of hands. It's a bit of a spicy question potentially, but how many people could go a day without using email and still be successful at work? All right, we have quite a few hands. Who could go 2 days and be successful at work? Who could go 1 week without checking email and be successful? All right, we have 3 or 4 hands up there. Sarah, what do you think about this?
Well, so this is my personal inbox right here. This is a screenshot was taken on a Wednesday afternoon, and you'll notice it's kind of a ghost town in there. So for me, a day without checking email at work is really just a day that I don't read my favorite newsletters over lunch. Most Atlassians really don't use email all that much when it comes to internal work and internal communication. We almost never use email to share a big project update or propose a new project. That's what Confluence is for, and to some extent Atlas too. And we rarely use email to ask each other little questions real quick. That's what chat is for. And if you go back to those guiding principles, this makes sense. Emails are far from ideal when it comes to transparency or future-proofing. Because only the people lucky enough to be on the original send list can engage with an email or really even know about it. So anyone coming onto the team after the fact or coming into the project later, well, they might just be out of luck and in the dark. Of course, we use email for communicating with people outside Atlassian. But other than that, for many, maybe most Atlassians, our inboxes primarily exist to catch all of the system notifications from the other tools that we use to get our work done. Now, in terms of tips for better email use, all those notifications I just mentioned, the ones you get from Jira and Confluence and Figma and Loom and whatever, try routing them to your chat tool instead of to your inbox. The advantage here is that it keeps them really neatly contained. So there's a little channel in your chat for just your Jira notifications, and all my Confluence notifications are in one place. And then a secondary benefit is that when you see that new email icon pop up, well, you know it's not a tool notification. So you already know automatically that it might be something a little bit more substantial and maybe even something that's worth interrupting your work for right now, depending on kind of how in the zone you are. So it just really helps you make better decisions about when to interrupt yourself and when to stay in the flow. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about email, probably. We're going to move clockwise around the framework here, and I'm going to toss it to India, who's going to talk to us about Confluence.
All right, so because we are not using email that much at Atlassian, a lot of the work and discussion that often happens in email is being shifted to Confluence for us. For us, Confluence is really a centralized hub for where information is getting shared. So whether it's a company announcement about the public holidays that are coming up, or a one-pager for a new feature that's being developed, or a personal blog about a team you're moving to or the new dog you got, all of those things are going to have a page in Confluence, which can then be shared via Slack. It can be shared in email. We very frequently screen share in presentation mode Confluence pages. I'd say we do that way more than we use presentations. And then if you have a project one-pager for a feature, for example, you can then take that page and break it down into smaller pieces of work in Jira Work Management. In the end, for us, most roads lead back to Confluence, and it's because it's a place where everyone has access to the same information and everyone can comment and discuss in one place. So for us, the main principles that Confluence is embodying are transparency and discoverability. In terms of transparency, we have our Confluence pages unrestricted by default. So that means when you make a new page, it's available to anyone in the company unless you restrict it otherwise. In terms of discoverability, Confluence has a great search feature, but we also make sure that every team in Atlassian has their own Confluence space. And in that space is where they're going to keep all of their documentation, processes, project pages, work in progress pages. So if you're going to work with a team that you haven't been before, you can usually guess that starting at their space is a good place to understand the lay of the land. So a colleague of ours, Sean, recently demonstrated why having a transparent and discoverable Confluence is so useful. He was asked to present at a conference last minute after someone else fell sick who was originally supposed to present. And I think he had about 12 hours to not just learn the presentation, but fly across the country to the East Coast and deliver the presentation. He's getting ready to board his flight, and he still hasn't received the slides for the presentation, but it wasn't a problem. He went on to Confluence, went to the original presenter's Confluence space, and went to recently worked on. He found a Confluence page with the name of the conference, clicked on it, got the full context of why we're going to the conference, who's going to be there, and it also had a link to the keynote slides. He downloaded the slides, learned the presentation on the flight, and knocked it out of the park when he landed. So he did all of this self-serve. He didn't need to wait for someone to email him or send him a ping, and that's why we find Confluence so useful as opposed to using email. When it comes to Confluence, there are many, many tips in terms of how to use it. But I think the one I would emphasize is one that we probably have to practice a little better ourselves, which is making sure to archive pages that are no longer relevant or no longer have the most updated information. That just really helps with the discoverability aspect of the Confluence instance. All right, so now we're going to keep moving along the quadrants, and we're going to talk about meetings, which I think are probably the butt of most jokes when it comes to communication channels. Everyone says that meetings should have been an email, and while I've definitely had that experience as well, I would say that there is some value in meetings, which is that they are expressive, they're real-time, and they allow us to dig into complexity in a way that no other channel is going to let us do. So at Atlassian, we really try to focus meetings on calling meetings on things that need robust discussion and interaction. When it comes to meetings, we are a fully remote company at Atlassian, so our meetings are all virtual by default. That means unless everybody is in the same room, we're all joining meetings on our laptops and joining a Zoom. And this can definitely lead to a little bit of Zoom fatigue, but it's a pretty fair trade-off for getting to work remotely. So what did I mean when I say that we use meetings for robust, interactive use cases? Things we use meetings for include brainstorming, decision-making and escalations that are more complicated, planning, so that can be planning a presentation like this, like Sarah and I have done, or quarterly planning. We also use them for one-on-ones and team connection, which is really important since we are entirely remote. We're not getting that organic connection in the office as often. And then finally, if a Slack message or thread starts to get a little long, we'll usually call a quick break and take it onto a meeting and just sort it out face-to-face for 10 minutes. I was on a Slack thread last week that got to 100 messages, I think, and we definitely should have done a Zoom meeting at message 20. It would have resolved things a lot quicker. So that's the use cases that we use for meetings. My tips for better meetings: the first, everyone knows this, but somehow we all manage to forget it at times. Be really clear about the goal of the meeting and make sure everyone knows the goal and how they're expected to participate. That's going to make sure that your meeting is as useful as possible for everyone involved. And then secondly, something I do frequently in one-to-one situations or small group situations is I share all of the information asynchronously before and then offer a meeting rather than making it the default. So what does that look like? A few weeks ago, someone joined a project that I was working on, and I sent them a Slack ping that had the project page in Confluence, and then I included a little context on the status and how it would apply to their role. And then I offered a 30-minute meeting if they needed it. That way, the person could have the time with me if they wanted it, And if not, they weren't stuck talking to me for 30 minutes when they already had the context.
Right.
I know you guys are all stuck talking to me for 30 minutes, but presumably you chose to be here. All right, so we're almost all the way around the circle. Sarah's going to bring us home to talk about chat.
All right. So as I said before, Atlassians don't use email a whole lot for internal discussions, and chat has really replaces email for us in a lot of ways. Definitely our go-to channel or tool for those quick, in-the-moment communications. And this has happened organically, but I suspect that one of the big drivers behind this is the fact that chat channels or rooms have a persistent history that you can go back and search through. So here's that future-proofing principle coming into play again. Things aren't tucked away in the inboxes of the blessed few who happen to be on the original sent list. It's just right there in the history for you to search today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, whatever. So as you can see from the screenshot, we use Slack, which offers both open and private channels, and most teams have both, at least one of each. So an open channel where anyone from across the company can pop into, ask a question, get some advice, and then pop out. And then a private channel that's really just the exclusive domain of the members of that team. And that's for discussing things that would really only be relevant or interesting to those people. As well as, like, not gonna lie, just kind of having a space where you can let your hair down, be yourself a little bit. I mean, not that we can't be ourselves anyway, but you know, if you need to vent a little bit, you've got a space to do that. If you want to swap recipes or show pictures of your vacation or your kids or whatever, that would happen in the private channel most times. Now, being a highly distributed company, and I actually want to just take a sidestep here and clarify, we're not a fully remote company. Like, we do have offices, and a lot of people turn up to those offices every day or some days, and then other folks like India and myself actually do work remotely full-time. But that does make us a fully distributed company. And so we have to be really intentional about building those personal connections with each other and maintaining them too. And chat helps us out with that. We use open channels in Slack to set up just topical rooms that kind of bring birds of a feather together. So for example, there's a Minnesota room where my fellow Minnesotans and I can go to discuss the best foods from the state fair this year. Everything is served on a stick at the state fair. So that's a hot topic of conversation in Minnesota. See also the weather. We like to talk about that too, it's up in snow country. There's a channel for old timers, not people who are elderly necessarily, but people who've been at the company a long time. A channel for people called Home Gym, for people who like to work out at home and they trade workout routines and brag about, you know, their pictures of their new setup that they just installed. So chat offers a great way to really like foster affinity groups, which I think is really important in this increasingly digital era, or sorry, distributed, also digital era. And then we have an announcements channel, which is really just for broadcasting short messages to the entire company. Now, only a few people have access to send messages through that channel. Otherwise, you can imagine how noisy it would get. So for most of us, that's just a read-only channel. Last, I mentioned earlier the idea that sometimes just enough information is enough, that thing about not making people drink from a fire hose. So Slack helps us out with that too. We tend to use the threading feature in Slack quite a lot. I believe this is pretty common in all chat tools. So if you use MS Teams, I believe they have threads as well. So like I might send a message about something in my Teams channel, and then my teammates, instead of replying in sort of the main area of that chat channel, they start a thread off to the side, and we have a discussion about it off there in the thread. And so that way people coming back into the channel after lunch or after a vacation or someone who joins the team new 5 weeks from now, they can scroll through the history and see that a discussion on that topic happened, but they don't have to dive into all the details or wade through all of the interleaved messages unless they want to. So it makes the chat history a lot easier to scan and digest. Okay, so my two main chat tips. One, make use of the threading feature I just mentioned. It really makes your chat a lot easier to manage and scroll through and digest. And then probably even more importantly, in my opinion, is to have fun. Create custom emojis. Use extensions like Giphy to respond to your teammate's message with a silly animated GIF or a meme or something like that. Share a link to that Spotify playlist that you're totally obsessed with today. Chat is a really unique communication tool in that it offers a lot of ways not just to communicate with each other, but really a lot of ways to just let you be you. So now that you've seen how we do it, we're going to walk through a couple of frameworks that I mentioned earlier. So you've been looking at this grid the whole time. This shows or reflects how we generally think about and choose communication channels at Atlassian. And we think it works pretty well. Like if you've got something big, big detailed communication, we'd much rather have that shared as a Confluence page rather than an email, for all of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, but also because the follow-up questions and the comments and the discussion that happens afterwards, it's so much easier to digest and participate in and just take in if it's all collected on a Confluence page versus barfed all over your inbox in 30,000 different email threads. So I encourage you to think about this framework next time you're going to send a message at work. Maybe take a picture of it now, hint, hint. So when you're in that moment, consider, how much information do you need to convey? Do you want this to be more of a broadcast or more of an interactive discussion? And then let this framework guide you to the channel to use for that. And maybe it's going to be different from the channel that you would normally use, which is scary, which is when you take a breath and you do it anyway. It might turn out worse than before, it might turn out better, it might be a wash, but the point is to try, because trying and all those little experimentations, little experimentations lead to little improvements that compound on each other and build over time and ultimately become something that can make a big difference.
All right, to wrap things up, I'm going to share one more framework that we use, which is a team communications audit. And you can use this to review what communication rituals your team already has and how you might want to improve them. And this is really straightforward. I'm going to walk you through this, and you're going to be like, India, you just want me to make a list? And that is correct. I would like you to make a list. You are going to list out every single communication ritual that your team has. So the example here shows stand-ups, meetings, status ticket updates. It can include coffee breaks or team connections that you have, team offsites that you have. List them all out. And then you're going to note the principles that are important to that ritual and also the purpose. I don't have it up there, but it should be important principles and purpose. So why do you have the ritual? What's the intention of it? And then what are the things that are important about the ritual you want to keep? Maybe it's that the ritual's async, or maybe it's that it is together. Maybe it's that everyone has access to the information, or that only a limited number of people have access to the information. All of those things are okay. Just make sure you're clear about them. Then you're going to list the current channel that ritual is happening in, and then you're going to review the effectiveness. So I would recommend doing this with everyone who is involved in that ritual. You can do it unilaterally, but communication is inherently between at least two people. And while a ritual may be working for you, it might not be working for the other people. And when it comes to communication, then it's not working. So effectiveness voting can be super easy. Red, yellow, green. Red, it's not working at all. We don't really know why we're doing it, or it's not doing its job. Yellow, it's sort of working, but there's some things we would change. And green, it's great as it is. Let's keep using it. Vote. Talk about why everyone voted the way they did. And then as a team, you can decide which of the rituals you want to keep and which you want to adjust. And adjusting could be changing how the ritual is done. It could be changing the channel that the ritual is done in, or it could be canceling the ritual entirely if it's one that is redundant or just isn't necessary. So that's our final framework, and I think that's everything we had to share for today.
Mm-hmm. And I see we've got 30 seconds left on the clock, which honestly, I'm sorry, it's not enough time for Q&A. But India and I are both on LinkedIn. Are our names up here? No, our names are in the agenda, so you can find us on LinkedIn really easily if you want to talk a little bit more about this or just swap ideas. We'd be happy to discuss with you, I guess, asynchronously.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for being here. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.